Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Dr. Jonathan Kuiken. I'm an associate professor of history at Wilkes University, and I was very kindly invited by Pastor Ian and Pastor Jay to just do a short little discussion of the history of the Reformation for Reformation Day. So my plan today is to keep this very brief. I'm going to try to speak for only about 20 minutes, and then I'll be happy to answer anyone's questions if anyone wants me to expand on anything or go in depth about the history of the Reformation or the Christian church more generally, or just history in general. And for people who are following on Facebook Live, feel free to text in any questions that you have, and my assistant Ian will read them for me. So, like I said, I was asked to kind of talk about this topic, and I'm just calling it a quick history of the Reformations. And you can see right from the title here that one of the most interesting things that's happened in the field of historical study over the last few years is people have begun to reassess the topic of the Reformation and added an S onto the end of the word. And that's because the Reformation was not really one event. It was a sequence of events that were interlinked together, and I think Reformations is actually much more appropriate. So one of the kind of central issues that I want to talk about today is obviously we're only going to be able to cover a small section of the Reformation and have to cover a lot of topics very quickly. But the ultimate end result of the Reformations is this process by which the unified church of the Western Christian world, so Central Europe, Western Europe, Spain, areas like that, England, what was traditionally called Christendom during the Middle Ages, is going to end up fundamentally divided by the end of this time period. And as we're going to see today, that's not really a process that I think anybody anticipated or even really wanted. But it's the end result of this process, a process by which the kind of questions of faith and questions of theology blend with questions of politics, questions of identity, and end up with a very divided Europe. So just a little bit of background to the situation, because unlike what a lot of kind of popular histories like to present, Martin Luther and the Reformation don't just spring out of nowhere. They don't come out of the blue. There's actually a long lead up to this situation, right? And one of the kind of causes of this kind of spiritual fermentation that eventually erupts as the Reformation in the 1500s is a period of kind of intense dilemma and problems and devastation, really, in Europe, about 200 years before this. We have a kind of sequence of events that come together to bring together both kind of a profound disillusionment with a lot of things and a spiritual institutional system in the Christian church that really fails to kind of rise up to the level that people are wanting at this time period. So I want to talk really quickly about late medieval theology, just to kind of set the tone. The Catholic Church, which is the dominant kind of institutional force of Western and Central Europe, has a theology based basically on the principle of the idea that the church is essential to salvation. The church is the bridge to salvation, right? They very much use this story of St. Peter and Christ, in which Christ says, "You, Peter, are the rock upon which my church is founded, and you have the keys to unlock heaven and hell." And there's a lot of symbology in the Catholic Church of Peter holding the keys to heaven and hell. Their idea is very much, therefore, that there is no salvation outside of the church. That the church and the seven sacraments that you take part in the church is the only way to heaven. And that to become saved is to basically receive God's grace, but to earn your way into heaven is to kind of acquire merit in the eyes of God, right? So God saves you through his grace, according to late medieval Catholic theology, but you basically get yourself to the point of being worthy of entry to heaven. So it's kind of a two-part deal, right? And so this means doing things like going on a pilgrimage. It means doing things like doing penance. It means things like buying indulgences, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, right? We can go into that in questions a little bit later. Now, this is the kind of system that exists, right? But it's a system that really doesn't lead to kind of the satisfying spiritual desire, particularly at a time of great crisis. And as I said, about 200 years before the Reformation, there's a sequence of events in Europe that really are devastating beyond what we could probably, actually sadly we can't imagine them now. But the first is that there's a terrible famine. It's called the Great Famine. It takes place in the early 1300s, from about 1314 to about 1316. It is one of the worst famines in recorded history in Europe. Millions of people die, and as many of you know, if you suffer severe malnutrition, especially as a child, it sets you up to have a compromised immune system for the rest of your life. And when these children who grow up during the Great Famine reach adulthood, and actually reach about my age, around 4 years old, if you go to the next slide, Jay, the next calamity hits. And this is what's known as the Bubonic Plague, or the Black Death. In the year 1347, plague enters into Europe, it spreads quickly, and it results in the death of about a third to a half of the population of Europe, depending on where you are. So if you can imagine the disruption to our lives caused by COVID-19, imagine if the death toll was about 100 times higher. This is devastating, absolutely devastating to Europe, to the citizens, and to people seeking out kind of God's solace and support during this time period. It just so happens that the church itself is undergoing kind of a period of political crisis during this time period, in which the Pope is actually out of Rome. He's living in a place in what's today France called Avignon, which many people believe is wrong, is that the Pope should be in Rome. And so the church itself is kind of facing these problems, and many people believe that these calamities are caused by the fact that the church has fallen into corruption. You want to go ahead? So together, all of these different things actually stimulate an intellectual kind of development, an intellectual movement that today we call the Renaissance. The Renaissance is an artistic, but also an intellectual movement, and it's caused by people basically kind of having this general idea. You know, we talk about the good old days. Well, for most people in the mid-1300s, there were no good old days. The preceding several decades were pretty awful, right? And so if you want to think about the good old days, many people actually skip over the entire Middle Ages, and they go back to the time when when things were still really good for Europe, and they consider that to be the time of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And a lot of these thinkers decide, these people knew what they were doing, these people knew what they were talking about, we should listen to them. And so by going back to these ancient writers, which many people had continued to talk about during the Middle Ages, people began to rediscover, at least in their own thinking, these ideas of the ancient past. So one of the people who kind of pioneered this was a writer called Petrarch in Italy. Petrarch coined the phrase ad fontes, which is Latin for to the source. In fact, our word fountain comes from fontes. And what Petrarch basically said is, if you want the purest form of knowledge, you have to go back to the original sources. You have to go back and read these things for yourself. Now, this was easy for Roman writing, because everybody spoke Latin. Right? But for a lot of the other ancient writers, you need to learn Greek. And in fact, it just so happened that the last Greek empire, called the Byzantine Empire, was crumbling at that very point. And many Greek scholars were coming into Italy, bringing their ability to read ancient Greek. So all of a sudden, in the late 1300s, early 1400s, you have the ability to read a lot of these ancient documents again for the very first time. You want to go ahead? One of these great scholars from this time period, late 1400s, early 1500s, is a guy called Erasmus. And Erasmus began to employ these same kind of principles, but he began to look at another source, the source of all sources. If you want to look at Aristotle and Plato and things like that, that's great. But what about if you want to look at the Bible itself? Well, Erasmus and others start to employ the same set of principles that other scholars have been using for things like mathematics and medicine and things like that. And they begin to go back and relook at the Bible. Every Bible in the Western Christian church at that time was written in Latin. It was a translation done by St. Jerome in the 4th century. And Erasmus and others said, hey, well, the Bible wasn't written in Latin. It was written in Hebrew and in Greek. And scholars like Erasmus and others begin to go back and begin to dig up these ancient copies of the Bible. And they retranslate it. And they find a lot of what they consider to be errors in the Latin Bible that is used by everyone at that time. And in fact, they begin to preach a message saying, hey, people should get back to the Bible. Should go back and read the Bible for themselves, because this is actually really important. Well, Erasmus also begins to call out things like corruption in the church. He begins to say, hey, the spiritual needs of people are not being met. We need to kind of reform ourselves. We need to fix things. We need to get back to these basics. like Ian was talking about in the sermon. And this environment, therefore, exists in Europe. Many people are questioning. Many people are asking, what does the Bible actually say? Many people are saying, how can we apply this to our lives? And one of these young people is a guy named Martin Luther. Now, Martin Luther is from a very interesting background. He's actually from kind of the middle of nowhere. He's from this little part of Germany called Saxony. It's far away from all the wealthy places in Europe. It's far away from the intellectual, heavy, kind of hitting areas of Europe. And Luther was actually supposed to become a lawyer. His dad wanted him to be a lawyer. But Luther had this deep, deep fear that he could never earn his way into heaven in the way that the church had been teaching. And so on his way back from law school, he actually supposedly had this event where he was knocked off his horse by a lightning bolt, and he swore to St. Anne, the mother of Mary, that he would become a monk, right? Now, whether this is true or not, or whether he just wanted to go out and go to law school, I don't know. But he ends up going into the monastery. And by all accounts, he's like a super monk. He does everything he's supposed to do. But yet, despite this, he can never find that spiritual solace that Erasmus is talking about, right? He can never find this kind of belief in his own salvation. In fact, he's beset by what in German he calls Anfechtung, which is, it's untranslatable really in English, but it's a kind of a combination of chronic depression and spiritual despair. And in fact, Luther's fellow brothers in the monastery even send him to Rome on a great pilgrimage to say, go to Rome, you'll feel better, you'll feel like God loves you and stuff like that. But when he goes to Rome, he sees Rome as a corrupt cesspool. He sees the Pope himself riding out in armor to go to war with another Italian city-state. And he sees, corruption beyond anything he could believe. And he comes back even more depressed. And so what do you do with a chronically depressed person who doesn't know what to do with his life? Well, you make him a professor. And that's exactly what they do to Martin Luther. He's ordered to go get his doctorate and to become a professor at the new university at Wittenberg. And that's exactly what he does. And there he's supposed to teach Old and New Testament. And so to do this, he gathers up these documents by Erasmus, these new translations and things like that. And he begins to read, and he begins to study, and he begins to preach, because he's also a pastor of a small local church. And through this process, he begins to kind of rediscover some of the ancient kind of concepts in Paul and other writings, like Romans. And there he discovers a passage in Romans 1:17 that says, the righteous shall live by faith. And this hits Luther like a lightning bolt. Because all his life he's been trying to earn his way into heaven. And here he sees that faith is a free gift, grace is a free gift, and salvation can be embraced through faith. Well, this is a remarkable thing, and Luther's very excited about it. Who is he? He's this little monk in the middle of nowhere. Well, all of a sudden, world politics comes to him. In an effort to raise huge sums of money to rebuild St. Peters Basilica, if you know in Rome, the beautiful church, St. Peters Basilica, every time you look at that, you can think that's the cause of the Reformation. Well, St. Peters Basilica needs to be built. On top of that, Luther's own bishop, the archbishop, has just bought his position as the archbishop, which you can do at that time. And he took out a gigantic loan, several $1 billion in today's money. So he has to pay back that loan to the bankers. So we have two big expenses. And there's one great way that the church knows to raise money, and that is selling these things called indulgences. Indulgences are basically little pieces of paper that forgive a certain amount of sins that gets you time off in this place they call Purgatory, which is where saved Christians go to burn off all of their sins that they committed in their life. And you can stay there for millions of years, depending on what kind of life you live, according to late Catholic theology. So they send these people around to sell indulgences, and people give money to kind of get time off in Purgatory. Well, you can imagine Luther's feelings when his poor little farmers who are in his congregation start to give their entire life savings to start buying these pieces of paper for themselves and for their relatives who are already dead, right? Well, Luther therefore condemns this, and he says, no, we shouldn't do this. And he decides, like any good academic does, that he's going to do this by basically inviting everybody to a debate. If you look forward. He posts 95 debating points to his church door. And these are called theses, right? 95 debating points. And Luther is no dummy. His friends used this new invention, the printing press, to print up this thing and distribute it widely. He's basically challenging the authorities of the Catholic Church to debate him. Well, a lot of these debating points are focused on the question of indulgences, but a lot of them also focus on his broader question of how you achieve salvation. And at first, he's ignored. But as this word begins to spread throughout Germany, and more people get an appeal, the leadership of the Catholic Church begins to take notice, and they begin to debate Luther. They come and they stage debates with him. And Luther gets further and further and further down the road away from the Catholic Church through these debates, through the kind of Catholic theology. In fact, after one debate, he's basically charged with being a heretic. And he's given time. They give him time to recant his views, to go back on them, right? But instead, he takes that time to write a series of books in which he elucidates his theories even more, including a very great book called On Christian Liberty, in which he basically states that salvation is by faith alone. Well, the Catholic Church responds by basically excommunicating Martin Luther. He is declared an outlaw by the Holy Roman Empire, which he lives in. And this means that Luther could basically be killed by anybody who found him. It was under the law that he was basically to be killed. Luckily for him, though, some very powerful people supported him, including his own prince. His prince had him kidnapped after one event and had him hidden away in a castle deep in the woods of Germany. There he translated the Bible into German so that everyone could read it. And the prince himself very cleverly had his men not tell him where they had taken Luther, so that when his boss, the emperor, came to him and said, "Where is this guy?" he could say, "I don't know." Well, Luther's gone for 2 years, hidden away in this castle. But this idea of salvation by faith alone, this idea of equality in the eyes of God, that doesn't matter whether you're a pope or a peasant, God loves you the same. This idea that you can read the Bible for yourself, these are powerful ideas. These are dangerous ideas. And you can imagine with Luther gone, these ideas spin out of control, including leading to a massive rebellion among lower class people who claim that Luther's ideas of freedom and Luther's ideas of equality mean that they shouldn't have to serve their lords any longer. This is called the Peasants War. Now, Luther, being protected by these very lords that they are rebelling against, knows which side his bread is buttered on. And he condemns these guys. And they are put down with great violence. Probably about 300,000 of them are killed in the first spat of huge amounts of violence. The other thing, though, is that it might be some peasants who kind of take these things and go crazy with them. But Luther's ideas, and the ideas that inspired Luther, also mean that you've kind of opened the Pandora's box of ideas. The idea that you can read the scripture and interpret it for yourself. Luther might think, hey, everybody will obviously agree with me. But as you know, people can have different opinions. And as Luther's revolution is beginning, someone else is taking that very same idea and creating a very different movement. And his name is Huldrych Zwingli, and he lives in Switzerland, in the city of Zurich. Zwingli basically takes the same principle, salvation by faith alone, and sola scriptura, this idea that the Bible should be the sole authority that we base our kind of teachings on. And he creates a movement that today we call the Reform movement, sometimes called the Calvinist movement, after somebody comes after Zwingli, right? So Zwingli and others reveal that this kind of idea is going to not lead to one church, or even two churches, it's going to lead to a wide variety of churches. And if we go forward, one of the things that Zwingli really disagrees with Luther on is Luther says things like stained glass windows and statues of saints and stuff are totally fine, as long as you don't pray to them, right? Zwingli says, the Bible says you shall make no graven images. And he has the churches of Zurich purged of any statues, any stained glass windows and things like that. In fact, he has them burned in the central square of the city to show these people that these saints have no power. There's no lightning bolts falling down from heaven because you burnt St. Anthony or anything like that, right? Well, it's not going to stop there, right? In fact, within Zwingli's own movement, some people say, well, hey, if you want to take the Bible literally, where in the Bible does it say that we should baptize babies? And they go a step further. And these people become known as Anabaptists. And they say you should only baptize adults. And they say the church should be separated from society, that the government should not be controlling what we believe, that we should have a church only of believers, and that we should live excluding everyone else. And these Anabaptists, many of them become pacifists. They say, thou shalt not kill. That means I'm not going to serve my Lord and his army. I'm not going to fight. And this is deeply dangerous to a society based on loyalty, right? Based on loyalty to your Lord. And in 1526, their pastor, Felix Manz, becomes one of the first people executed for his beliefs during the Reformation, as fellow Protestants kill him. Have him killed, drowned in a lake. Now, this kind of explosion of different ideas sees the Reformation moving in all sorts of different ways. It also causes deep alarm, as you can probably imagine. And it causes deep alarm particularly amongst the Catholic leadership, and particularly in the central part of Europe under the control of an emperor named Charles V. Now, Charles is a Catholic. He wants to bring unity back to the church, whether that be peacefully or through violence. And because of this, many of the leaders of the Protestant movement decide they better get their act together and try to forge some kind of unity so that they can confront the emperor as a united front. Ulrich Zwingli and Martin Luther come back together in 1529 and try to hammer out their differences. They agree on 14 of 15 points. That 15th point, though, is what the bread and the wine represent in the Eucharist. Zwingli says it's purely symbolic. Luther says that Christ is spiritually present. Christ's body and blood are spiritually present in those elements, right? They refuse to agree with one another, mostly in large part because they don't like each other personally. Now, there are efforts in 1530 for the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church to come back together. There are efforts over the entire decade in which these leaders come together and talk, try to hammer things out. And in fact, it becomes even more clear to them that they've got to solve this, because just a few years after this, in 1534, we have a very radical band of Anabaptists who believe that it is the end of the world, the end times, and that they represent the new kingdom of Israel, seize control of a major city in Germany called Munster. There they declare themselves to be the new kingdom of Israel. They take away everyone's property, and in fact declare themselves to be the reincarnation of King David and others. The leadership of this movement takes, the first leader actually dies a rather bloody death. The second leader takes over 60 women as his wives, claiming that he's the new King David, and they execute anyone who opposes them. This kind of complete radical off-the-wall apocalypticism is so terrifying that Protestant and Catholic armies work together to destroy them. And in fact, they execute them, and not to be too grim, they hang the bodies of the three leaders in a cage on top of the cathedral and leave them there. And in fact, the cages are there to this very day as a reminder. Now, this is a warning to the leaders of Europe. If we do not control this situation, this is going to go off the rails. So, we have an effort after this for the different movements to try to define what they believe in an effort to try to reach some kind of compromise. The Lutherans start first. They forge a consensus called the Augsburg Confession. This is an agreement of all the things that we believe. The Reformed people forged a consensus behind John Calvin, the great theologian, who writes a book called The Institutes. They agree on what they agree, or what they believe. So these different groups are beginning to kind of draw lines around themselves. If you believe this, you're one of us. If you don't believe this, you're not one of us. Right? And now they do this again with the idea that, like, if we can all come to the table with what we actually all believe, we can maybe find some kind of consensus, right? But unfortunately, by defining yourself, you also make those disagreements more permanent. And not everybody wants to kind of like come back together. and forge agreement. There are others who are claiming that these people on the outside are heretics. They shouldn't be compromised with. They shouldn't be talked about. And it's the Catholic Church, too, that is also undergoing this process. They're also undergoing a kind of self-definition. And in fact, one of the movements that emerges from this period is a new order called the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, founded by a guy named Ignatius of Loyola, who interestingly could have possibly been a classmate of John Calvin at the University of Paris. They might have actually attended courses together. We don't know for sure, but they were there at the same time. Ignatius of Loyola and the Jesuits, instead of calling for kind of this compromise, call for reform of the Catholic Church, to purify the Catholic Church, and to kind of retake land from the Protestants, intellectually and physically, to kind of rebuild the strength of the Catholic Church, right? And so as these movements try to forge some pathway forward, you have the forces of kind of compromise and the forces of division working against one another. And when compromise ultimately fails at one last conference at a place called Regensburg in 1541, it's decided that the only way forward is war. And war, unfortunately, is not going to solve anything. You're not able to wipe out ideas on the battlefield, right? And the Catholic Church gathers together at a place called Trent, and over about 13 years, hammers out exactly what they believe. They reject every single teaching of the Protestant movement. And this is interesting. They do this despite the fact that most of the theologians there agree with some or all of some of the Protestant teachings. Why do they reject it then? Well, what is the central fundamental premise of Catholic power? It is that the church is the way to salvation and that the church is never wrong. And if the church admits that it's wrong, what happens then? It falls apart, right? And so in the end, they reject everything from the Protestant movement. And so by the mid-1500s, we now have walls built around all of these different groups, and compromise dies. And as we're going to, if you want to talk about it afterwards, we can go a little bit further down the line, and the Reformation continues to develop. But I'll end at this point, because I think this kind of shows how we get to this point where these kind of different factions that all want the same thing have now ended up as different denominations. So I'll end there for now. I'm happy to answer anybody's questions, to talk more deeply about anything related to what I talked about, or anything else that you're curious about. And if anybody wants to chat any questions, they can do that too. Does anybody have any questions, anything we may talk more about, or anything that make any sense?
So do you get a feel for the timeline from where you started? We're looking at 150, 200 years?
Yeah, about 200 years. The actual events of the Reformation from Martin Luther until kind of this absolute break is really only one lifetime. Luther dies in 1546. And so basically by the time Martin Luther dies, we've kind of reached the end of the point of compromise. There's a peace treaty in 1555 that basically ends the war in the middle part of Europe. And that's kind of considered to be the end of the first phase of the Reformation. So really about less than 50 years. So one generation, really. 1.5 generations. Yeah.
I have a question about purgatory. As I read the 95 Theses, he regularly mentions purgatory. So I don't know, being a person that began to really read the Bible and know the Bible as a professor, I would have thought that at some point he would have abandoned.
He does eventually abandon.
I was wondering, that was my question.
Ned asked about purgatory and about Luther's kind of initial acceptance of purgatory. It's still there in the 95 Theses. And Luther gradually changes his views over time. And eventually he does say that there's no biblical kind of basis for purgatory, and so therefore it doesn't exist. But you can see the kind of power of these ideas, right? They lag along for years, right? And so, the views that he expresses in the 95 Theses are not like a fully developed theology yet. It takes him a few years to kind of get to that point.
Mention the roots of United Methodism coming out of the Anglican Church. Where's the Anglican Church?
Sure, yeah. The Anglican Church, the story of the Church of England is very interesting as well, right? And it's kind of intimately tied into all of this. Basically, really quickly, as many of you know, Henry VIII, the King of England, splits away from Rome because he wants to get remarried. And there's a whole backstory to that, too, that I can get into if people are interested. But in essence, what Henry wants is he wants to be Catholic, but have himself as the head of the Catholic Church rather than the Pope. He doesn't want to change the theology, right? But of course, when you open up that door, is it going to stop with just taking the Pope off the throne and putting the King on the throne? No, it opens up the possibility of change, right? And in fact, the very woman that he wants to marry, Anne Boleyn, is secretly a Lutheran. And most of her advisors are Lutherans. And so when Henry opens the door to this, he allows Protestantism in by the back door. And people kind of slowly start to undermine this religious change in England. And when Henry actually dies in 1547, a year after Luther, his son, Edward, comes to the throne, and his son has actually been raised by Calvinists. And so the Church of England radically swings over towards the Reformed side of kind of the religious division, right? And as some of you may know, Edward actually doesn't live very long. He only lives about 5.5 years on the throne. He dies as a young man. He's only 16 years old when he dies. He has no children. And so his sister becomes the queen. His sister, Mary, who is a Catholic. And what do we know Mary as? Anybody know?
Bloody Mary.
We know her as Bloody Mary, right? Now that's a very unfair designation because Henry and Elizabeth, who follows her, killed many, many more people than she did. And she becomes known as Bloody Mary mostly because they want to discredit her after the fact. But we have a swing back to Catholicism, and England becomes a Catholic nation again. And if you know the story, Mary doesn't live very long. She only lives 5 years on the throne, and then she dies. And her sister, Elizabeth, becomes the next queen, and she is a Protestant. But having seen this seesaw back and forth, Elizabeth says, you know what, folks? We're just going to kind of chart this middle road here. We're going to be Protestant, but we're going to be a moderate form of Protestantism called Anglicanism. Eventually, it's going to be called Anglicanism, right? We're going to have some elements of the Catholic kind of liturgy and things like that. We're going to have mostly kind of Reformed theology, but we're going to kind of be in the middle here. She does that for very pragmatic reasons. Now, when you have a middle-of-the-road compromise, how many people are usually satisfied by that? Nobody, right? Nobody's satisfied by that. And so you actually have people who want to push the church more towards the Reform, who become known as Puritans. And these Puritans decide that England is fatally and fundamentally corrupt forever, and they decide that they can't stay there, so where do they all go? Anybody know? They all come here, to New England, right? Or a lot of them do. They actually go back and forth several times based on politics, but that's another story. Now, we have other people on the other side who want the Anglican Church to become more Catholic, right? And so over the next several hundred years in England, we basically have kind of this seesaw back and forth of the Anglican Church between those who kind of want more Protestant theology, those who want more Catholic theology. And in the end, what ends up happening, really, is you end up with kind of this mushy kind of church that doesn't stand for a whole lot because of all of these kind of political reasons, right? That the Anglican Church is very tied in with the leadership of the country. They're very elitist because that's how you keep stability, right? And so when we get to the mid-1700s, we have a lot of people who are members of the Anglican Church, but who are profoundly kind of dissatisfied with this kind of mushy theology, this mushy kind of commitment. And the early Methodists, the Wesley brothers and people like Whitefield and others, kind of grow up in this environment and decide that they want a church that is much more kind of devoted to this kind of personal relationship with Christ, rather than kind of an institutional, elitist religion. I'm being a little unfair to it, but just to kind of emphasize the point. And so this is where Methodism comes from. They all work within the Anglican Church for a long time. They're actually Church of England ministers, right? But eventually their kind of divergence, politically, theologically, socially, gets to the point where they're not even considered to be part of the Anglican movement anymore. They kind of branch off and become their own thing, particularly here in the United States, or what will become the United States.
Isn't it interesting how turmoil drove people away from England and transplanted to here, to the Netherlands, and spread the gospel?
Yeah, I mean, the story of what Ned just said, for those who couldn't hear it, is turmoil, forces these people to move and spread, right? And it is interesting because Puritans do take control of England for a while during the English Civil War, and then all of them go home. They all go back to England, and then they lose, and then they all leave again. So the Puritans are a very international bunch. They end up moving all over the place. And the American colonies are very much this kind of very tied to the story of the Reformation more broadly, because it's not just English Puritans that come over here. It's groups from all over Europe, right, that have a tough time fitting into these kind of powerful alliances between a particular church and a particular state, right? It's Catholic Church in some places, it's different factions of Protestants in other places. And if you don't fit, if you disagree, it's a very uncomfortable existence for you. And that's why you have people like French Huguenots coming over here. You have people like Mennonites coming over here. You have people like Quakers coming over here, and so on and so forth. Because America is seen as this place where you can go kind of live your life and kind of establish your own community.
Wasn't there a point where there were two popes, too, earlier?
There's actually a point where there's three popes.
Three?
there's two popes for a while, and then three popes. This is all in the lead up to the Reformation, and part of that kind of spiritual, feeling that people have that the church is not looking out for their best interests, right? There's factionalism within the Roman Catholic Church. There's a point where there's a pope in Avignon and a pope in Rome, and then to try to compromise, they elect a third pope, but then the other two popes refuse to step down, so then there's three popes. And then finally they call a conference together and they fire all three popes and they hire a new one. So, yeah.
The Basilica, what was was it just for personal lauding that they wanted to build that Basilica? It seemed like the indulgences, that's a great building fund, but is that what it was for, to raise?
Yeah, that's a good question. The question's about why did they just choose to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica. Basically, the original St. Peter's Basilica was built by Constantine the Great in the 4th century. And it was more or less completely decrepit. It was actually, they couldn't even conduct services in there anymore because the ceiling was like falling down and stuff like that. And so they really did need to rebuild it. But the kind of late Renaissance popes, following from this Renaissance humanist tradition of kind of trying to emulate Greece and Rome, they wanted something epic. They wanted something grand on that kind of Roman scale, right? And the belief on their part was that this wasn't a waste of money, that this was, this was the kind of headquarters of Christ's vicar on earth, and how could they stand next to great emperors or leaders of other faiths and stuff like that and say that our faith is the best if we're in this rinky-dinky falling down old cathedral, right? And so this was basically bringing the best and the brightest from all over Europe, the best architects and stuff like that, to build the grandest building that they possibly could. And it was actually started way before Luther, but the Pope who started it died and it kind of fell on the back burner for a while, and then it kind of came back in Luther's time. It took several decades to build it, so. But it, I don't know if any of you have ever been there. It is pretty grand. So, but you have to remember too that this time period, there's a deep fear that Europe is basically on the verge of being conquered by the Turks, and so there is this kind of desire to kind of show that Christianity is more powerful than Islam as well. So that's kind of part of it as well.
That was my impression of the Catholic Church getting to the point where it was its own kingdom, with a king.
Well, for much of the preceding 1,000 years, right, the popes had kind of struggled with local kings to kind of establish who was supreme. And there were periods where the Pope really was basically not just the spiritual leader, but had a tremendous amount of political authority too. That kind of ebbs and flows over the preceding few hundred years. Jay, did you have a question?
Yeah, I would say, so what's going on in the church? Like, there's obviously a large emphasis then that gravitates towards Europe. What's going on in the church in, say, Israel and the surrounding Middle East?
Sure, that's a great question. So Jay's question, if you couldn't hear, is what's happening to Christianity and the Christian church outside of Europe? Well, in the eastern part of Europe, you have the Orthodox Church. And so the Turkish expansion in that time period, the Constantinople, the kind of heart of the Greek Orthodox world, is conquered in 1453. And Constantinople becomes Istanbul, becomes a Muslim city. So Eastern Orthodoxy has kind of recentered itself in Russia. The Russians they consider themselves the third Rome. First Rome, then Constantinople, and then Moscow, right? Outside of that area, in the Middle East and things like that, Christianity is basically a minority religion in large sections of the Ottoman Empire. It's dominated by Turks. And according to Muslim law, you can practice your own faith as long as you pay something called the jizya tax, which is basically you pay a tax to have your religious liberty, more or less. And so there are large, fairly prosperous Christian groups in Egypt and in Syria and in other places and stuff like that, but they are politically excluded and kind of economically towards kind of the middle of the bottom. And so the Muslim kind of elite is definitely in charge of those areas. And then there are smatterings of Christian groups even further east. In fact, when European explorers show up in the Indian Ocean world, they discover that there are Christians in India already. And when they make it all the way to China, they discover that there actually are some remnants of the old Chinese Christian church there too, or at least memories of it. And so the Europeans are quite surprised to find these remnants of Christianity that exist in the wider world. And of course, this is also the time period of Christopher Columbus and all these people too. So we have the expansion of European influence into North and South America as well, and the conquering of large sections of Latin America by the Spanish Empire during this time period. So you have Catholicism being spread in the New World as well, oftentimes at the end of the sword. But yeah, so this is the time period where Christianity truly becomes a global religion. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you, everybody. And feel free, if you think of any other questions later on in the day, you can always email me. And I'm happy to continue this conversation. So thank you for all your time and for your questions.